Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today I want to talk about classics, why I personally think reading classics is important, and also why I find it concerning that we're almost kind of looking down on classics a lot now. I mean, there's still a lot of booktubers that read a lot of classics, and I'm by far not even near the top with the amount of classics I read. I actually don't read that many, generally speaking. But I still find that there's more and more people kind of saying, I refuse to read classics, I don't like classics, I hate classics, I think classics are overhyped. And I find that concerning. Now, I will have 3 parts in this video. I will have a part talking about why I personally think classics and reading classics are important. I want to talk about kind of the attitude towards classics and why I think a lot of people have that attitude towards classics. And thirdly, I want to talk a little bit about kind of how to read classics, or why a lot of people are really discouraged by trying to read classics. And yeah, those are the 3 parts. And now let me start with why I think it's important to read classics. I think classics are history, and I think reading classics is incredibly important for our understanding of people from past times. And by the way, when I'm talking about classics in this video, I don't just mean your classics, your Dickens, your Jane Austens. I am also talking about modern classics to a certain degree, and I certainly also mean classics from other non-Western cultures, because in my opinion we quite often forget about them. Now, I said classics are history, and I think it's actually for me a little bit the other way around when it comes to fiction and non-fiction and learning and understanding people when it comes to classics compared to modern literature. Because in modern literature, I do think that we kind of get this thing, we saw it with Black Lives Matter, when on the first day everyone just recommended fiction and not non-fiction. And of course, fiction is great, but don't use it to educate yourself. And I don't think that we can learn about history through classics. We can't learn about the Victorian era through reading Oliver Twist. We do need to still read non-fiction about the Victorian era. However, I do think that by reading classics we can further our understanding of the people who lived at that time. Because in a way, classics kind of are our looking glass into the minds of the people who lived in those times. And so I think reading classics is incredibly important from a history standpoint, but also from like a literary standpoint. I am currently reading The Wheel of Time, and of course this is in no way a classic, although I think we could already almost call it a modern classic of fantasy. And while reading this, I start understanding where so much of the tropes of modern fantasy come from. The same with reading Lord of the Rings. Reading staples of the genre that you prefer reading in can help you realize where tropes come from, and it can be a really fun experience. And sometimes, especially with genre classics, reading them can seem a bit boring because the tropes are so old already and we've kind of moved on. But I still think it's important to analyze them and to kind of see where what you're currently reading is coming from and where it got its inspiration from. And you can also, of course, just Wikipedia it, but I do think that it's a completely different experience, and it gives you a completely different understanding and appreciation of literature, of a genre, to kind of read it for yourself. Reading classics also gives you the opportunity to analyze stuff in a way that you can never do in YA, for example. And I'm just gonna use YA, not because I think it's kind of the lowest and the worst of literature or whatever, because I have talked about that a lot already on my channel as well. I think every literature has its point and its worth. And just because it's not the same doesn't mean that one has to be worse than the other or anything like that. I'm just going to use YA in this video because I think it's kind of just like the polar opposite of classics in a way. But yeah, when you read classics, you're just more intellectually engaged with the story and with the text, in my opinion. That doesn't mean that if you don't read classics you're any less intelligent. There's loads of ways we can kind of intellectually stimulate ourselves, but in terms of reading, I think classics is the best way to do that. For one, because a lot of times you need to learn a lot about history, about the time that a classic was written in. Without that backdrop of history, a lot of times a classic will not be as exciting as it is. For example, to read Dickens, you have to know a lot about kind of the poor were treated in the Victorian era. To 100% understand where Frankenstein comes from, you kind of have to know the advancements that science and medicine made at the time that this was written and how scary that was for people. I got a lot more enjoyment out of the beginning of The Count of Monte Cristo than some of the people that I buddy read this with, because I knew a lot about French history already and the time that this was set in, and I could kind of understand where all the people were coming from and the gravity of what was happening to our main character and what he had done. And so I think that classics just pose a chance for us to kind of, you know, stretch our intellectual muscles. And I think that is really important to do that. And so I think we should all read classics. We should all try reading classics. And that, of course, brings me to my second point, which I said, like, as the third point of how to read classics. I think a reason why a lot of people think they don't like classics is because they're not used to it. We as a book community, I think we can say that we are very YA heavy. Whether you like that or not is your personal opinion. Me personally, I enjoy it less than a few years ago because I have started reading less YA, and so there's just less recommendations for me on BookTube, on BookTwitter, and so on, because I'm not as excited about YA anymore. But now back to reading classics and how you read them and why I think so many people have trouble reading them if they've only just started reading classics. Let me make a little comparison. This is not perfect, but I kind of just want to try and make a point. Let's say you enjoy cycling. You enjoy cycling a lot. You usually cycle maybe along rivers. You're just cycling in the plains and everywhere where it's just like no hills. And you really enjoy that. So you think, yeah, I can cycle really well and I cycle a lot, so let me now try to get up the really steep hill. You won't get to the top. I can guarantee, unless you're doing a lot of other stuff to like tone your body on the side, you probably won't get up the top, no matter how much you cycle. And I think it's kind of similar with usually reading YA or genre fiction and then suddenly reading a classic. Classics, you can't just read like that, usually. You have to, again, know a lot about the background. You have to get used to the writing. You have to get used to themes and to the way you read it, to the way you have to analyze it. And I think when you just read a classic for the first time, and of course there's some classics that are easier to read and others that are harder to read, but when you read a classic for the first time and you have only read YA so far, you're not gonna like it. When you get up that first hill, even if you have been cycling a lot before that, you're gonna hate it. You might be really excited at the top after you finished it and maybe proud of yourself, but while getting to the top you're probably going to hate it and you're probably going to be really annoyed. And that's how it is. And the second hill is going to be easier to get up, and the third hill is going to be even easier. And I think that's how we need to see reading classics. It's a progress. The first classic you're going to read you might enjoy if you pick up the right one, but you might also hate. And I don't think that we should see this, we read our first classic and we hate it, that we should see that as, okay, classics aren't for me and I really don't like it. And then let's get to the third point that I wanted to make. And that is kind of the attitude towards classics and why I have a problem with that. First of all, I want to say that I do understand that a lot of times the attitude we have towards classics comes kind of from the defensive. It comes as a reaction to the hot takes of reading classics and literary fiction makes you a more worthy reader than just reading YA, which obviously is not true. However, I also don't think that the attitude of I hate classics, I don't like classics is accurate. I think it would be more accurate to say I'm not interested in reading classics. And that not being interested might just be out of kind of spite towards those people who think you need to read classics to be a valid reader. Or the not being interested might just be because you're not interested in getting used to reading classics. Just like with cycling, maybe you're just not interested in getting up that hill and you're perfectly happy just cycling in the plains. And that's completely fine as well. Even though, again, I do think that there's certain arguments to be made why it's important to read classics. Now you might think it's kind of just the word, whether or not you say I don't like reading classics or I'm not interested in reading classics. What's really the difference? But I think the difference kind of is the mentality behind it. And it's kind of already this internalized mentality that we have that we need to read classics. Otherwise, we're less intelligent and we're less worthy as readers. And it's along similar lines of the points that I also made in my why I have problems with the YA community video, which I will leave up there and down below, that just stand by it. If you're not interested in reading classics, just stand by it. But don't just use I don't like classics or I think classics are overhyped as an excuse to say I don't need to read classics anyway. Because it's ingenuine. And also I think that the phrase I don't like classics is just plainly wrong for a reader. I think saying I don't like classics as a reader is similar to saying I don't like stories, I don't like books. Because classics are as various as books. You have the different eras, you have different countries, you have different traditions, you have different thought and philosophical schools that go into reading classics. And I think it would, for example, be perfectly fine to say I don't enjoy reading Victorian English literature because I don't enjoy the way they typically wrote, I don't enjoy the topics that they wrote about, and so on. For example, me personally, I have found that I do not typically enjoy German literature as much as English written literature or English language literature, especially when it comes to the 20th century. I don't like the way the stories are told typically because they're told in a very grim and very dark and very realistic way, which I personally don't prefer. I personally still try to read German literature, but that's again something that I decided myself that I see as important for my personal education, but I would also be completely fine in saying, okay, I'm not interested anymore. I've tried German literature, it's not for me. But yeah, I just think we need to change the way we talk about classics in the book community. I think we need to stop saying I hate classics. I think we need to stop saying I don't like classics. I think it's completely fine to continue saying I'm not interested in classics. I might have a discussion with you, without judgment at all, why personally you aren't interested in reading classics, but I still want more appreciation for classics, even though you don't read it. And on the topic of appreciation of classics, I do get that when we talk about classics, it's very white focused. And we do not appreciate or do not give a spotlight to classics by people of color or by BIPOC enough. And so I did want to recommend a channel that I found recently, and it's called The Artisan Geek, and she makes a lot of videos on classics that aren't written by white people, and I did already write down some of those classics from her recommendations, and so I will leave her channel link down below if you're interested in that. I feel like this was a very rambly video, but it's just something that kind of was on my mind and that bothered me. And so yeah, if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribe to my channel. Tell me in the comments down below if you enjoy reading classics and what eras you most enjoy reading from. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!